All right, we're a few minutes after noon, so we'll go ahead and get started. Again, thank you so much for taking the time out of your afternoon to join today's webinar. We'll be going over the Greater Kaweah GSA's new groundwater allocation program and the recently adopted rules and regulations. We're going to try to keep this within the hour time frame, respect everyone's time, starting with just a few housekeeping items. I'd like to welcome Reina with Linguistica Interpreting and Translation Services to talk about how to take advantage of Spanish interpretation during today's event. Reina.
Hola, muy buenas tardes a todos. Bienvenidos a la reunión. Durante esta reunión vamos a tener interpretación simultánea al español a través de la reunión. Para seleccionar interpretación en español, si usted está en una computadora, usted va a seleccionar el icono que parece un mundo abajo de su pantalla. Después de seleccionar el icono que parece un mundo, usted va a seleccionar su lenguaje de preferencia. En este caso será español. Le invito también a seleccionar la última opción que indica Mute Original Audio o silenciar el audio original para que de esta manera solamente escuche en su lenguaje de preferencia. Después de silenciar el audio, usted estará lista para participar en esta reunión en su lenguaje de preferencia. Si tiene cualquier comentario o pregunta, lo puede someter en su lenguaje y aquí estaremos para asistir. Si usted está usando un celular o una tableta, sus opciones son diferentes. Usted va a seleccionar los tres puntitos indicando More o más opciones. Después de seleccionar la opción de los tres puntitos, usted va a seleccionar manejar interpretación del lenguaje. Después de eso, selecciona español y por último, una vez más, el silenciar el audio original y no olvide oprimir listo o finalizado para activar la función. Con esto, muchas gracias. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Reina. All right, a few other housekeeping items today for the webinar. Did want to let everyone know who's joining today that your video, your microphone is turned off, so only the panelists have that feature available. We also want to let you know the webinar is being recorded and it will be available online in the next several days. So if there's something you want to go back and listen to again, that'll be accessible to you on the website. We'll also distribute that to the interested person's email list. For any questions during the webinar, we just ask that you use this Q&A feature. You can see on this slide in the bottom, it has a dark blue circle around it. You can type a question into that feature at any time, and we'll go ahead and address those questions at the end of the presentation. So we'll read them out loud verbally, even if you type them in, we'll read them out loud so everyone can hear the question, even those who are on the phone, and then our panelists will address those. For any technical difficulties, we ask that you use the chat feature. If there's something wrong with audio or you're having issues with the Zoom features, you can drop those into the chat. That is highlighted in a circle, a light blue circle. So using those two features will help us just kind of streamline what your needs are throughout the event. And for the agenda today, just made it through our housekeeping. I'll be passing it over to Greater Kaweah GSA's General Manager, Eric Osterling, who's here to present on the rules and regulations and the groundwater allocation program. And then we do have a section, pretty significant amount of time for any Q&A. We know a lot of you have probably come with a lot of questions. So we want to have time for that. We also have Matt Clinchu here on the line as a panelist. He is the GSA's technical consultant, so he'll be available as well to answer any questions with Eric. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Eric.
Okay, do I have slide advanceability, or I'm just going to ask you, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Eric Osterling, General Manager of the Greater Kaweah GSA. Thank you for joining us today. As was mentioned, we're recording this in both English and Spanish, and those will be YouTube videos posted to our webpage in a few days, which is what we've typically done with these types of webinars in the past. I have about 20 slides, and I don't want to rush too quickly through them, but I want to save enough time for Q&A. I'm going to start very briefly. Only a small handful of them are just some background on Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014. And so if you'll advance to the next slide, please. This is just a very simplified version of the legislative process that led us to where we're at now. It was a comprehensive bill package signed by then Governor Brown in 2014, and it mandates groundwater sustainability over a period of time for us ending in the year 2040. Our original plans were due in January of 2020, and so we have been moving, but we're at the early stages of implementing this groundwater legislation. What's unique about groundwater control and management in the state of California is that this particular set of bills grants local control to groundwater sustainability agencies, which were either new agencies formed as a conglomerate of multiple land use and water use agencies, or individual land use and water agencies declared to cover a particular area. Next slide. Just a quick look geographically. The Kaweah Subbasin is one of 515 basins and subbasins in the state of California. It's one of the larger ones compared to many of the smaller ones on the coast or up north. And our groundwater sustainability agency is 220 acres of the 440,000 acres of gross acreage of the subbasin. There are two other GSAs that make up the difference. The Mid-Kaweah GSA there in the middle, which is a combination of Tulare Irrigation District and the cities of Visalia and Tulare. And then over there on the east side, kind of in the tan color here, is the East Kaweah GSA, made up of districts and communities, primarily relying on the Frank Kern supply. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Okay, so just as an introduction now, moving into what we're really here to talk about, and that is the recently approved rules and regulations, the accompanying setting of a groundwater pumping allocation and program and cap, and then the associated penalties that go along with it. These are currently adopted policies, and it's important to understand that SGMA is an iterative process. The numbers and dollar amounts that you're going to see in this presentation are set annually. We do have targets that are included in our rules and regulations, policy documents for adjusting those numbers downward over time, because what is intended here is a glide path rather than correcting the problem overnight. We want to gradually correct the issue between now and the year 2040. Slide. So it's important to know how we got to where we're at with this particular process. It's been ongoing for a little more than a year, and in earnest over the past year. We've conducted a ton of direct outreach and public forum and workshops, webinars over the past year. In January, the board issued a public review draft of our rules and regulations, which set somewhat of a framework. There was a 90-day public comment period issued, and that was extended 2 weeks to May 12th of 2022. We continue to hold more workshops and webinars, and we had public committee and board meetings to discuss many of the concepts. And meanwhile, we were continuing to receive public comment. So even outside the public comment period, we've been receiving comments and suggestions on this process and what our thinking had been, was, and is today. Our final public workshop, or this is actually a webinar, is today. And the rules and regulations, which really drive not just the allocation, cap, and penalties, but many of our other policies over time, it will increase in its scope. The original was adopted in August, and then an approved pumping allocation and penalties was approved in September. These allocation numbers and the associated fees become effective for any of your activities related to groundwater pumping beginning October 1st of this year, so just under 2 weeks ago. Any of the technical recommendations for how we set these numbers, what kind of impact they're going to have, are made by a third-party technical group. That's not to be confused with our technical advisory committee. This group is specifically formed out of engineering consultants, such as Matt Clinchu, who's on the phone right now, and hydrogeologists and agronomists and other experts in their field that can help us make these decisions. And there was emergency action that was originally considered. It's important to know that this schedule could have been ramped up, but the board opted not to. Rather than making things effective in spring 2022, they decided to push it to the beginning of the current water year, which began on October 1st, 2022. Next slide. Here's an infographic that we've gradually updated over the course of the past year to give you a snapshot of what the allocation and cap and tiers look like. Really, the whole idea is to treat any kind of intentional groundwater recharge and surface water supply in particular separately from anything else. So this graphic shows order of importance of water supply starting from the bottom and moving up. And so we want to continue to encourage people to leverage whatever surface water supplies they may have, followed by access to the sustainable yield supply, which is a shared number across the whole entire basin. All 3 GSAs agreed to that number, and that is about 10 inches or 0.83 acre-feet per acre of evapotranspiration. And that's another important distinction here that needs to be understood by anybody listening in, that all of the volumes of water that I'll be talking about are in evapotranspiration, not gross pumping, not the total amount you pumped, but how much, whatever your irrigated land used in net. Then we get into what we're calling temporary tiers or penalty tiers. And these numbers basically make up the balance of what the overall cap is, in addition to the sustainable yield, first 10 inches. And so there are splits. They aren't equal between tier 1 and tier 2. There's slight percentage differences that are outlined in the rules and regulations. But in total, between the sustainable yield supply, temporary tier 1 and temporary tier 2, combined, the cap there is 2.70 acre-feet per acre of ET for this current water year of 2023. Beyond that, there's a prohibited tier. That's when you get above the cap, and that's where the penalties become much more severe. Next slide, please. So groundwater pumping cap detail extended here. Intentional groundwater recharge activities are accounted for separately. As I mentioned, we are working with those surface water purveyors and their partners in order to account for that in our water dashboard. Again, an annual allocation of ET of groundwater and any of our allocations of groundwater through this program are based on your gross acreage. So that is the amount that the county considers the acreage of your parcel when it submits to you a property tax bill. Public water systems are still being kind of worked out. We do have a plan, and it's following really an equitable way in which we've handled other special uses, that we can't use satellite imagery to calculate evapotranspiration, and we have to find another means to come up with a net pumping estimate. And so really the first step that we took was working with some consultants in the dairy industry to produce a document that estimates net groundwater uses for dairy facilities. That's an appendix to our rules and regulations. It was prepared by Four Creeks Engineering, and there are other GSAs that are adopting that same document. And it's meant to be refined over time. Just like I said, SGMA is an iterative process. Landowners allocated the sustainable yield, or 10 inches or 0.83 acre-feet per acre. Any of these kind of estimates are generally conducted on a long-term average, taking a combination of wet and dry periods to find a trend line that we can manage towards. And the penalty tiered groundwater is again being offered as temporary and optional. We continue to use the word temporary because these are not meant to be volumes of water that you'll have access to in perpetuity. They will be trending downward in volume between now and 2040. I mentioned the combination of the tiers and sustainable yield. All accessed acreage under this regulation is treated equally. So we didn't disproportionately treat, for example, communities differently than surface water areas, differently than groundwater only areas, differently than any other beneficial user or use of groundwater. Next slide, please. Okay, a little more detail on the tier system and what the current penalty rates have been set as. And so for tier 1, first of all, I'll say that the sustainable yield comes at no cost as long as you are paying a property tax assessment to the GSA. For those assessed parcels, you would have seen that in your property tax bill this past year at $10 an acre. For those acres that are not included in the current property tax assessment, the GSA is seeking to work with those landowners to enter into opt-in agreements where they would get an allocation in exchange for paying their share of the $10 an acre assessment. And so beyond that $10 an acre assessment, there is no additional cost for the sustainable yield bucket of 10 inches. But then moving into the temporary tiers of tier 1 and tier 2, they currently, for this year, have been set at $125 an acre foot of ET and $250 an acre foot of ET, respectively. And then beyond the cap, that's where the real pain does occur if you exceed our pumping cap number of 2.70 acre feet per acre. And that would be at a cost of $500 per acre foot. But then more importantly, a reduction at a 1-to-1 rate of your future allocation. So for example, if you were to pump 5.7 acre feet per acre of ET in a year, you would lose your entire 2.7 the following year, and then the balance would be carried over to the next year. So it does actually carry out over, beyond just the next year if you do pump double or more of the 2.7. And I mentioned tiered pumping will be reduced over time. There's some very helpful tables, I feel, in our rules and regulations that show the targets that we have for reducing these tiers over time. And managed aquifer recharge credits will be treated differently. Next slide, please. There are some flexibilities that we tried to build into all of this. 2 of which are carryover and transferability. I'll start by talking about carryover, and that's really how long can you keep the allocation of groundwater. In considering that, we needed to be sensitive to the surface water users and not force them to pump in lieu of what they've traditionally done, which is prioritize the use of their surface water for direct irrigation demand or drinking water demand, or for recharge purposes. We've set a maximum of 5 years rolling in schedule for the sustainable yield supply. And so if you were to carry over your first year sustainable yield allocation of 10 inches, you would, for the next year only, you would lose a one-time 10% of that. And then after that, there would be no leave behind. It would 100% of that remaining 9 inches would carry over into future years up to 5 years. There is additionally a maximum of a 5-year rolling for tier 1 and tier 2 temporary supplies, but they do have an annual reduction of 10% as opposed to just the first year having a 10% leave behind. Undeveloped lands, and we use irrigated lands regulatory program and enrollment there as a back check for who may have developed prior to or after January 2020, have no access to either tier 1 or tier 2. And the significance of that date is that is the adoption date of our original groundwater sustainability plan. Next slide. Okay, transferability, that is essentially the movement from one place to another of groundwater that you are allocated. And the first 10 inches sustainable yield, and both tiers may be transferred. So all 3 will, but there is some difference between the tiers and the sustainable yield. All of this movement in distance of groundwater allocations is being managed and monitored through our online water dashboard. And there are some differences between how far and where you can move that water. In some cases, you can only move it one zone, as there is a map that's included as another appendix to our rules and regulations that shows the subbasin divided up into management zones, or I like to call them protection zones, because they were drawn up and delineated based on the things that the state essentially told us we have to consider protecting. And so the protection of those beneficial uses and users of groundwater was how we determined the drawing of the lines there. But in addition to the static map, and I'll actually, if you go to the next slide, these are the zones. We do have a much more detailed version of this in a Google Earth file, and under our groundwater allocation webpage, there is a resources link there for that Google Earth file, so that if you wish, you can open it up on your computer and then zoom into your property or properties and understand better where you can or cannot transfer. But for restrictions on how many zones you can move groundwater between 1 and 3 zones that you see here, I'd refer you to the rules and regulations, and any specific questions, contact staff at the GSA. Okay, groundwater pumping cap and detail continued. Measuring pumping and credit. So we are generally moving towards meters. There's at least an encouragement for all of our growers, really all of our groundwater users, to have meters, to maybe not necessarily report that information to us, but to better understand their demand on the groundwater. It's also a good back check, particularly in those instances where we are by default measuring irrigated cropland by using satellite ET. If your ET number looks quite a bit different than your metered information, that's a way that you can come and talk to us about it to see if there's a correction necessary. In the rules and regulations, you're also optionally given the chance to use metered information in lieu of the ET. So you can opt out of the ET solution if you are uncomfortable with it. The challenge there, though, however, is that really the pumped amount of groundwater is typically more than the actual used or consumed groundwater by plants. Unless you've got a very efficient irrigation system, typically your pumped amount is more than the ET. So something to consider. The other thing that's a challenge for us is that the actual point of pumping is important to what we're trying to protect. And sometimes you do have wells that are pumping from quite a bit of a distance from where that pumped groundwater terminates, typically for irrigation purposes. And I mentioned earlier, we have a problem with using the ET information for well fields, dairies, industrial, netted orchards, and some other things that we're going to have to find an alternative in lieu of metering, until which we go to metering instead. Next slide. Okay, so a little bit about groundwater measurement, additional to what I just discussed. I've mentioned a couple times that any kind of managed recharge, intentional recharge that you conduct, or really anything that is an asset or a benefit that you're reporting, whether it's surface water delivery or intentional recharge, things like that. In the context of surface water delivery, we're working with your surface water purveyors in order to aggregate that information rather than have to rely on you to report that directly. There are some instances, though, like, for example, with riparian users, where they may not currently have a relationship with the Kaweah St. Johns Rivers Association, but they do have a riparian right. We will be asking them to either develop that relationship with the Rivers Association or find a way to report that to us directly. The dashboard, again, is leveraging a number of things, but one of its strengths we felt was the huge cost savings and carryover of familiarity by leveraging the Kaweah ILRP farm system that is used to track the irrigated lands program in the Kaweah subbasin. Additionally, we developed a relationship with the Kings River Watershed Coalition for those portions of our GSA that, and subbasins that are not in the same watershed coalition. The online water dashboard, it does include, and so do our rules and regulations, different mechanisms for support tickets and flagging things for an appeals process. Some of those appeals will be addressed and decisions made by the full board, some by just staff, and some by the technical committee that I described earlier. Next slide. So drinking water pumping, we are still working on that solution. For context, we have calculated in this area the various public water system communities. If you take the gallons that they report to the state by law and you look at their service area and you run the numbers, it does work out to an equivalent gross usage of 1.2 to 1.4 acre feet per acre. Which again, I said gross, we're holding the irrigated properties to a net usage through ET calculation. And so their net usage through recycling, things like that is going to be less than the 1.2 to 1.4, likely something very close to 0.83 acre feet per acre, which is the sustainable yield. None of the GSAs, including the Greater, are currently contemplating immediate oversight or regulation of domestic wells that are not on public water systems. There's a few reasons for that. There are a lot of them. There's not really a whole lot of organization, and their impact is fairly minimal, considering that many of them are, or most of them are on septic tanks, and so their net usage is pretty small. The other consideration is what we have to adhere to in the Groundwater Sustainability Act under California law, and that is some of them, depending on how much groundwater they use, are defined as de minimis pumpers. So anybody who pumps less than 2.0 acre feet per acre for the specific purpose of domestic use, not for anything commercial or industrial, they have certain exemptions under the law. Next slide. Okay, so this is something that comes up. We have a few things that come up pretty frequently, and this is a really big one. Is this new program is going to generate significant funding in the form of collection of fees, and what are we going to use that money for? The tiered pricing, first of all, required some very careful consideration of how much money that would be, and the budget forecasting, the revenue generation forecasting was difficult because we anticipate in wet years when surface water users have access to surface water, they'll be using that in lieu of pumping groundwater. And so our revenue stream will be more limited to groundwater only areas where it doesn't matter if it's wet or dry. But in those years that are dry, like we've had the past couple of years, we will expect to probably see the vast majority of people, surface water users or not, hitting their wells and paying a higher amount and making more revenue come in. And we have a number of different programs. The first thing we have to look at is what we already approved through stakeholder process. It is Section 7 of our Groundwater Sustainability Plan that has various projects and management actions. Management actions is just a fancy term for programs. And then we would have to leverage a public process to find other uses, and this is a non-exhaustive list, but some of the bigger ideas that have been coming up are temporary or permanent land retirement or even partial repurposing in order to reduce groundwater demand. One of the big things in the initial review of our groundwater sustainability plan by the state was that we needed to update it to show a much more robust well mitigation program there, while we carry on and have a little bit of a soft landing approach to reaching ultimate sustainability in 2040. The point that the state has made is that many wells are going to be impacted between now and then, and we need to have an effective mitigation program for those wells. Those first two in and of themselves are very expensive endeavors. Anybody who's had to modify or replace a well understands how much those are. And then land repurposing, we could be talking hundreds of dollars an acre in order to incentivize voluntary changing land use throughout the area. And then we have other smaller programs and coordination efforts, such as with the discharge programs. Next slide. Okay, so this is just kind of a reminder of some of the next steps, and there aren't a whole lot of them simply because we've been at this for a very long time now. Want to make sure that you are setting up your account on the water dashboard. The easiest way to visualize what your impact is and what you might expect is to have an account and look at your fields. If you notice anything that looks off, to have the to be proactive and let us know about it through flagging those issues in the dashboard. Staying engaged, we pretty much put everything that we ever do with this program and anything else for that matter onto our website. And so this is a specific link to the allocation, groundwater allocation page that contains not just this video eventually, but many of the other previous workshop and webinar videos, PowerPoint presentations, some of the studies, technical documents and legal documents that can give you some background. You can sign up if you haven't already, and I assume that many of you or most of you already are if you're on this webinar, to our email notices and updates through our website. There is a sign up form there, or if you're having trouble with that, you can just contact us on our phone number, which is listed here, which also does allow for text messages. So you can do one or the other, and we'll try to help you out. And the strongest form of outreach and communication is word of mouth. There are a lot of stakeholders, especially in our GSA being so large. It's hard to get in front of everybody. We do our best, and we try to get the messaging right to the people that we are fortunate enough to have one-on-one conversations with, who are listening to these kinds of outreach activities, so that they can get the message to those who maybe haven't been participating as closely as others have been. And then just lastly, next slide. This is just a quick snapshot of the page that you would be looking for on our website. That top menu, you would just click on groundwater allocation, and it would take you to this page that has all of those resources. And with that, we will move on to Q&A, and I've been watching from my computer here, and I can see that we do have a few.
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and start with Manuel asked a question right off the bat. If I use more water on one field than is allocated and less water on a field than is allocated, will the water be averaged out?
It will be through the dashboard. If you transfer and move stuff around, you have to actually go in yourself and do it, basically shuffle that around in the dashboard. But through your account and your farm unit and your multiple fields, you will be able to move that around into a balance.
Great. So Gail asked, since she has 50 acres of pasture land that gets flood irrigated, is that part of this allotment? Yes,
the last part of your comment there about flood irrigated is the distinction. So it really doesn't matter if it's pasture or if it's walnuts. If it's irrigated, and at least a part of the source, if not the entire source, is groundwater to serve that irrigation, it is subject to it regardless of what the commodity is.
All right, so we had a question about dairy. When dairy manure and sludge is spread on open ground before it's worked in, it'll pull off moisture that's picked up in the ET. How would we get that removed from the overall ET used?
So I know that the vendor for our ET, Land IQ, has been working on some of those things. There have been some questions too about cover crops, which I know the dairy industry has a lot of incentive program money tied into that. So it is a fairly small amount of ET, but if something you feel that is unique on your property needs to be adjusted, again, you would need to let us know.
Great. John says, our water dashboard shows last year's usage, October 2020 through September 2021, and the usage to date up through August 2022. Is it correct that this is the ET-based usage we would have been charged if the program had been in place the last 2 years?
You know, John, you're a unique situation because of some of those covered areas, and that's why we want to refine the number for you specifically. And just for those who don't know, John represents a nursery that he's not alone, just one of the larger nurseries that it's one of those unique categories where we are getting an ET reflectance from them, but because of some variability in what's covered and what's not, they might need some fine tuning in order to maybe take those areas that are uncovered and then interpolate over to the areas that are. So we'll continue to work with you on that, John, but I would like to actually talk to you directly after, offline.
All right, so Case asked, why do we not get credited for precipitation?
You do get credit for precipitation, but there is some nuance to that that's being worked out. It was removed from the dashboard while we worked something out. That does not mean you're not getting some rainfall. In fact, how we came up with the 0.83 acre-feet per acre or 10 inches of the sustainable yield does include what our technical consultants assume is the percentage of gross rainfall that actually becomes groundwater. So you are getting rainfall there. One of the things that's still being cleared up, though, is what, if any, of the remaining gross rainfall should be treated as effective precip, meaning that it's directly used by the plant. There are some opinions that none of it is in this area, and there are some opinions that quite a bit of it is. And so we are trying to shore that up with non-biased technical justification rather than opinions on it, which is really mostly what's out there.
All right, so Stephen says the sustainable yield is going to be 0.83, but on the 2021 average ET for idle land is 1.3, and no crop in the year is averaged at 0.9. So we start in the first penalty tier.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah.
0.83.
Glad you can read it.
Okay, so for idle land, you're saying what you're seeing in ET is 1.3, and with no crop, and the average is 0.9. Okay, so you're worried about idled land and what it's reflecting. We again are running against quite a bit of that, where you have unirrigated pasture land or just idled land that might be reflecting some things from weeds, but you have reasonable proof that you haven't been irrigating it for any purpose. And so those are case by case being taken out and adjusted in the dashboard as exempted. So don't get too upset right away when you see stuff like that in the dashboard. Let us know about it, and we're happy to work through it with you, because we don't want to be holding you accountable for any ET really, for that matter, that's not served by groundwater.
The next question is, I have grazing land that is not irrigated. How many credits do we get for grazing land, and can we transfer credits to irrigated farm ground? That's
a great question. And so if it's unirrigated grazing land now, I mentioned in my slide deck that there is a cutoff point, and it's January 31st of 2020, and basically whether or not a particular field was enrolled in the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program as an irrigated, so maybe it was irrigated prior to that date. That changes what the answer is to your question. If it was, you would have access on that now unirrigated pasture land to all of the sustainable yield in tiers 1 and tier 2, and you would be able to transfer under rules that are applied to any other kind of irrigated agriculture. But if it's been undeveloped this whole entire time and prior to January 31st of 2020, you would only have access to the sustainable yield and its ability to be transferred.
Okay, so Manuel asked, what does a separate category mean for dairies? Is it not subject to the 2.7 acre foot per acre?
It is actually, that's a good question, and it's a separate category, meaning it's a management area because it can't be calculated through ET. So the report that's an appendix to the rules and regulations, I think I have it actually linked separately for ease of access on our allocation page. What that does is it calculates a functional equivalent of a net usage of a dairy. And so the dairy facility footprint in all cases throughout the area as an average is being estimated at about a half a foot, which is below your sustainable yield. But it allows you to take the remaining balance in the allocation, be it above that 2.5, and redistribute it amongst other fields that are irrigated in your operation.
All right, I'm going to switch over because there were some questions I saw that were put into the chat. The first one is, if you are located on the GSA line of Greater Kaweah and Mid-Kaweah, and currently, or no, excuse me, Mid-Kings, and currently use Kings County Water District water on this ground, how would this get allocated in your water dashboard?
As of right now, the short answer is, if it is a field, doesn't matter the source of the groundwater that was irrigated by groundwater, then in that case, it really doesn't matter where it came from. So if it was a well that was in Kings County Water, or excuse me, in Mid-Kings GSA, so Kings County Water District, bear in mind, straddles 2 subbasins and has, is a part of 3 different GSAs. But if it was surface water coming from, say, the Kings River, then in that case, we would be working with the surface water purveyor to take that portion of demand out of what we assume to be served by groundwater, even if the source of that surface water was outside of our subbasin.
All right. Charlie asked, on the dashboard, it shows I used 3.15 acre feet. Did I go into tier 3?
Are you in the chat or the Q&A?
So it looks like he asked in both. So I'm going through the chat.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Sometimes it just helps to read it.
Yeah.
You did not go over because you're only held for what it shows from October 1st of this year forward. We included ET values by month, going back into the previous water year, really just to help you understand what your last year's demand was, but you are not held accountable, at least by the Greater Kaweah GSA, for any activities that occurred prior to October 1st of 2022.
Okay, so in the chat, again, question from Landon. He said, I'm planning on fallowing some of my open farmland. Do I need to submit a fallowing permit?
Yes, you would need to let us know. There's not a fallowing permit. You just need to let us know that you're fallowing that property, so that we can change its designation in the dashboard. For any potential to have an ET reflected, it would be minimal if you're not irrigating it, but it would still be there.
Great. Another question in the chat. Can you move water on your water dashboard between different landowners? For example, if you have different ownership in family entities, or if you rent ground from a neighbor, can this be looked at on one water dashboard?
Yes and no. So the way the dashboard is designed is that rather than the irrigated lands program, which many on this call I'm sure are familiar with, the onus isn't on who is actually operating that property, whether it's the owner or a leasee. It all starts under Sigma and on this dashboard with the landowner. So the landowner could, for a leasee or somebody else who's managing that property, delegate the responsibility, but the title owner of that property has to delegate that to somebody else, even if it's their farm manager, PCA, stuff like that. And the transferability, to answer your question, if it's going to another farm unit that's managed by somebody else, so that's more of a sale. There are more limitations there than there is what you can do on your own farm unit.
And then I wanted to follow up on the question that Charlie asked in the chat, because he added a little bit of nuance. So he initially asked about if he used the 3.15 acre foot per field acre, did he go into tier 3? But then he asked a question about adding in, there's 348 field acres versus 489 parcel acres.
It's based on what the total you're seeing for that APN. Your allocation is to the APN, and we're recognizing that you can have multiple fields on an APN. You have to have your aggregate ET for all fields on that APN to understand where you are in relationship to the cap.
Great. Okay, I'm going to transition back into the Q&A feature. Question from Manuel: who is collecting the money, and what is it going to be used for?
We would be collecting that through direct billing. What we would use it for was in a slide earlier.
Go back to this.
Yeah, you might go back to that. So it was one of the last slides. Let's see, with all that under window. Sorry, everybody, we see some things on our computers you guys don't, so it blocks the screen. Okay, so it's really, to answer your question, it's down at the bottom, that sub-bullet, the last one there. And I'll just repeat, it's important to understand that we're treating this completely separate from our general fund. So this money that we would generate from this program specifically is intended to be put into kind of a separate budget category that would be intended to be put right back into the hands of the people paying it. So it's not to handle our general overhead or anything really going on that is not going back in the form of a program or a project that is going to. So it could be a recharge project. It could be incentivizing groundwater conservation. So it's meant, and it would stay all within the GSA. So it's not meant to be spent outside of the GSA. It's meant to directly benefit the impacted stakeholders within our GSA. But land retirement or any other form of repurposing and well mitigation, which are both required by the state of California to be in our plans and be emphasized and made a priority, are very expensive endeavors, each of them. And so probably the lion's share of the revenue collected through the penalty fees is going to go to those two programs.
Great. So David asked a question. It sounds a little bit technical, like related to his computer, but maybe you know about security.
Oh, David, okay, so what David asked is about opening the Google Earth file that I mentioned earlier that's linked to. If anybody has any issues with that, you can contact us and we'll try to get it to you in another way. But on PCs, I know if you right mouse click and then click Save As, that sometimes helps it. It's folded into a zip file, so it's a compressed file, and sometimes that causes some issues. But we're trying to make it easier to get to. We wanted to get that up quickly for anybody who is really needing it immediately, though. And but our development and GIS team are trying to find a better way to bake a cake, so to speak.
And then I think that you answered this question, but in case you want to add any nuance to these specific items, they asked, are you going to use the money collected from Tier 1 and Tier 2 pumping for recharge activities such as surface water purchase and developing settling ponds?
We very well could. There's some legal restrictions on how we would do that. If we purchase surface water and we construct recharge facilities with those funds, at least the immediate ability for us would be something that would benefit everybody. So any recharge benefit, any molecules of water that would would have been purchased and then embanked into the aquifer would have to be spread out equally amongst the Greater Kaweah GSA impacted stakeholders. But there are instances where maybe these protection zones that were that map that I showed you in the presentation, maybe we're looking at separate accounts there. And so if one of those protection zones, for example, wanted to do something that only benefited their protection zone, and I'm speaking without my attorney here, so I want to caveat that I may be wrong on this, but I could see having zones of benefit is what I think it's called when it comes to collection of fees and taxes. And so that's something we could look at more precisely over time.
Okay, so Manuel asked again, back to his initial question about averaging the water across the fields. And he said, did you say I will have the ability on the dashboard to move water around from field to field?
Yes.
Next question, are there any monies available to be paid to landowners to not farm?
Yeah, so that's the land repurposing in this slide that's still up, that last bullet. There's a number of ways that you can change the overall groundwater demand on a property. In some cases, it might be 2 crops are grown a year on that property, and you incentivize that grower to forego planting of one of them. And so you essentially pay them to lay off. There's been some similar programs, in particular out in Westlands Water District and other areas for cotton buyback. We're trying to mimic some of those. There's one that, process that's it's called a reverse auction. And so that is out of the overall fees that we collect. We take that and we create a program that has certain priorities and that are assigned values in a ranking criteria, so that any applicants that submit their interest in being compensated, they submit a bid. And based on various things that have not been worked out, but some things that might be considered would be, the overall groundwater demand that's being saved, obviously, the geographic location. If it's in a protection zone, we're considering to be particularly concerning. So lots of subsidence, or there's a lot of wells that are going dry. So maybe it's that property is adjacent to a public water system or a community well community. Those kinds of things might change the ranking and how we prioritize which applicants would be funded over time.
So Mark asked, is this billed annually based on the annual average ET?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The current thinking, and the board needs to make a decision on this. We've been seeking input too on how those will be billed, what the frequency is. And so there's some difference there. There are some public water systems that are saying, just send me one bill. And then, so we might wait till the end of the year and just send them one bill. But then on the flip side, we have irrigators who are saying, I really, I might not be tracking the dashboard as closely as I need to be. And so if I've already gone into tier 1 by the first 6 months of the water year, send me a bill so it makes it noticeable to me. And then lastly, we've talked about 2 times a year in those cases. So at the end of the water year, sending the second bill, and that wouldn't just be the remaining balance. That would also be an opportunity for the GSA if there have been things that have been refined or fixed. For example, with Land IQ ET information, we can true up their overall annual bill for that water year. But we are not talking about billing monthly. And in between, though, likely try to do our best to send out postcards and other mailers and things to make sure people are keeping track of their current use.
Okay, so Michelle asked a question about the dashboard. As a landowner, can I have our ranch manager handle the dashboard? How do they have access? Is there a separate login, or is it open access?
Yeah, there's several levels of access. A lot of these questions about the dashboard, I would encourage people to go to the dashboard site. There's helpful videos that explain a lot of these things on And that's a crossover, not just unique to the Greater Kaweah, but the other two GSAs in the basin that are participating for how access is delegated. But again, it starts at the owner of that property that has to delegate that access, and what level of access would go to, for example, the farm manager.
Great. The last question in the queue for now, if you do not pay your assessment, how will you be penalized, and how will collections be handled?
So there's, in the rules and regulations, there are several discussions in there about enforcement and collection of fees and penalties. There are punitive options at our disposal. Bear in mind that these GSAs are regulatory agencies. They're kind of like mini regional and state boards, at least what we have at our disposal. We don't want to have to leverage those tools that were provided by state law, but we do have those within our ability. There are also things that that we can do that are not even related to the groundwater allocation or sending you a bill or going to the courts. One example would be that the governor's executive order fairly recently gave a new responsibility to groundwater sustainability agencies like ours, that any new well permit applications that come in have to go to the GSA for approval. And we could very likely, and will probably very likely, cross-check that with, you know, where the balance is for a particular account. And if there is lack of payment, we might not approve that well permit application until things are settled.
So Mark asked, if I used double my allocation last year, does that mean if I reduce my pumping by half, I should be close to my target allocation?
Yeah, if you're using that 2.70, if you have access to tier 1 and tier 2, yes, then that math checks out.
Right. So Milo asked if you could go into more detail in how rangeland will be allowed to transfer native yield to irrigated lands. Will all rangeland in the mountains be allowed, or only within a certain distance from irrigated lands?
Well, so there are the eastern side of the sub-basin, and there are portions that are Greater Kaweah GSA, are also the extent of the sub-basin boundary, and it's a scientific boundary that the state of California drew for us. It's very confusing, and it splits parcels. What we have built in to the rules and regulations are an opt-in or an opt-out. And so as long as your parcel is at least a significant portion within the GSA, you can choose one or the other. In the case that I believe you're describing, where it's unirrigated pasture land and you want to leverage the allocation for that, if it's split, you would not probably have a property tax bill, and so this opt-in agreement would require first that you have to pay the $10 per acre in order to get access to the native supply, and then once you do have access to that native supply, you would be able to transfer it within your farm unit. So there are quite a few ranchers that are on that east side that are leveraging that flexibility to opt in. But if you're already, if that grazing land is entirely within the GSA, an opt-in agreement is not required. And if it's an APN that's 4 acres or above, you're already paying the assessment, and you would just include that unirrigated pasture land in your account and be able to use it to balance other assets.
Great. The next question is, how do we establish water credits due to riparian rights if the property is adjacent to a natural waterway?
So a riparian right to surface water is outside of our legal wheelhouse. I would suggest, if you're on the Kaweah St. Johns, which I assume you are, that you would contact the Kaweah St. Johns Rivers Association. And so the contact there would be Larry Dodson at Kaweah Delta Water Conservation District.
Carlos asked, what about rainwater? Does it count towards our allocation?
Okay, we talked about this a little bit earlier, so this is a repeat. but rainwater is already part of your allocation in a fraction, and that's only the portion of gross rainfall that is assumed to recharge groundwater. So basically makes it past the root zone, doesn't evaporate off the surface, and makes it back into the groundwater underground aquifer. So that's a part of your 10 inches or 0.83 sustainable yield. That's one of the inputs of many. But beyond that, what may be considered the other portion of the remaining gross rainfall that lands and is what's called effective precipitation that is actually being used then by the plant and reflected in the ET. That's something that we're still working on, and there's a conflict of technical opinions on it that is pretty widespread. And that's why, if you're familiar with the way some other GSAs throughout the valley are handling rainfall, there's a wide swing. It's one of the most variable approach things, I think, to all of this, because there are some technical studies that say 0% of the remaining is effective precip, and there are others that say much more of it is.
All right, one last question here. I've seen in the last year parcels planted to orchards that were previously unfarmed for years. Why are such lands given the same water allocation as farms that have been operated for generations?
Well, if it's been in the last year, they will not. If it was unirrigated and not part of the irrigated lands program prior to January 31st of 2020, then they only get access to and will only be held to the sustainable yield. They will not have access to Tier 1 and Tier 2. So if they exceed the sustainable yield, they'll go directly into the penalty $500 and a 1-to-1 loss of reduction of their sustainable yield in future years.
A question from Richard. If you purchase a new ranch in the same GSA, do you assume those water rights for that year? Is it prorated based on date of acquisition?
So allocation is based on the property. So if there's change in ownership of a property, it's no different than any other asset on that property. Call it a well, call it an outbuilding or anything. So whatever is still in that account at time of sale, when you buy it, is what your account is. So it just, I guess, to answer your question, it depends on what the previous owner did. If it's during this period of October 1st of this year going forward.
Right.
Is there any in chat? I saw.
I think we hit all the ones in the chat. Ashley, did you see anything else? No. Yeah, I think.
Well, we're just over an hour, and considering that we're not getting flooded right now, I think I'm going to call a conclusion to this workshop. I'm glad we were able to get to nearly all the questions, if not all of them. But we do encourage you to contact us if you didn't feel comfortable asking during this webinar. I will say that this week we have open office hours, but I do have staff out sick, which has made it a challenge to try to schedule some appointments. But just in general, we do make ourselves available to take phone calls or sit down in person with you to help you through things like registration and understanding of the dashboard, and understanding of the rules and regulations that really are driving most of this. So thank you again for participating, and we'll try to get this video processed and up onto our website very quickly. Thank you.